Okay, so this is going to be the first in a series of videos that I make in which I walk you through my PowerPoint of music for Quizbowl, and I have the accompanying list that, like I said, we'll be going through the first 15 composers or so, starting with the beginning of music and all the way through Schubert. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we need to understand is that music, for all intents and purposes, as it comes up in Quizbowl for the majority of the time, is going to begin in the post-medieval period, and that would be during the Baroque. The Baroque era is an era of artistic expression, both in music and in art, that is in the 1600s, the 17th century, and the very beginning of the 1700s, the 18th century. It's when you find the birth of the opera, the rise of oratorios and cantatas, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. But first, you have to understand the birth of music in the Western sense is going to be Gregorian chant, so called because of obviously named after a pope by the name of Gregorius. And here in the PowerPoint, you can obviously click on it, and if it doesn't take too much time,
what is Gregorian chant?
And it walks you through it.
Before we answer
so we'll
that,
go
let's hear
here
a quick
to
story.
minute number 6
The
or so.
Liber Usualis. As you listen, try to notice the aspects that are pointed out by the video.
Okay,
Here
so
it is.
Here it goes. And that's it. This is Gregorian chant. So, at any rate, I want to do that. We'll move on to the next slide, hopefully. And so we now come to our first named composer, and that is Claudio Monteverdi. He was composer in St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. This is St. Mark's that you see here, and there it is again, as you can see it. This area in Venice floods all the time, and sometimes they put boards so that tourists can walk on it. But he's so important because he's going to give us not the first opera per se, but the first still widely performed opera, and that would be in 1607, Orfeo. Orfeo, of course, is going to be about the mythological character Orpheus, who is noted as being an instrumentalist on the lyre. But this is the one that is usually considered one of, if not the first widely still produced operas. So we move on to more Baroque artists. This is being Pachelbel. Pachelbel comes up exclusively in Quizbowl for his canon in D. A canon, I don't know the exact kind of definition, but it is a particular work with particular kinds of characteristics. You can quickly Google it to find out, but you will probably be familiar with it because you will hear it at weddings very often. So here it goes. And then over time, the rest of the instruments will pick up. Here comes the violin. And then note, this is obviously the cello. We have a viola here, I think, and a couple of violins. So there it is. And here comes the third instrument. And note in the canon, he'll continue to play that same bass line as they then add variations to it and so forth. And here comes the third, or I should say the fourth. And note he keeps playing that same line. Like I said, it's a part of the construction that a canon is going to have, as it were. So we move on to the next one, and that is Henry Purcell. He is English, and he is famous for the opera Dido and Aeneas, which features a lament sung by Dido, which she refers or talks to her servant Belinda. That's something that comes up not infrequently. And he's also the composer of the Fairy Queen, but Dido and Aeneas, which obviously book 4 of the Aeneid tells their story, but he has the opera featuring both of them. Now we've come to Vivaldi. Vivaldi comes up quite a bit in Quizbowl. His nickname was the Red Priest, and he was from Venice and a master of the concerto. Of those, the most famous is going to be obviously the Four Seasons, which of course is a part of his contest between harmony and invention. Both of those will come up quite a bit. And particularly the Four Seasons is a popular answer line. It will talk about how in the clues, thunderstorm is evoked by some of the music in one of the seasons, I think that being summer. There's a barking dog that comes up quite a bit in the questions when you're talking about it. But it is obviously as well one of the most famous pieces of music. I'm going to play it for you just briefly, and you will instantaneously recognize it, this being spring, or La Primavera of the four. But as I said, it's instantaneously recognizable. All right, so that is going to bring us to Johann Sebastian Bach. And like I said, for all of these, you need to, QB reader it and see what are the things that come up a lot for each of these, and take note particularly of the clues that come up repeatedly and put it on a flashcard. And that way, obviously, it'll help you get the questions when they come up when you're playing. But at any rate, Johann Sebastian Bach, J.S. Bach, very often you'll have to be prompted if you just say Bach, because he had a whole tons of kids that many of them became composers themselves. I think Carl Philip Bach is one, and then there's a few others that became composers, but this is J.S. And he is the genius of the Baroque. He is famous for his cantatas. They are musical pieces that are choral pieces, and some famous ones are St. Matthew's Passion. I think there's a St. John's Passion, lots of passion cantatas, which, like I said, are choral pieces. And he is obviously noted for his keyboard music particularly, and concerti. And so there are several items that you need to know for him. One of the most famous is the Well-Tempered Clavier, in which he goes and produces pieces for every key signature, and then the Art of the Fugue. A fugue is a particular kind of composition similar to a canon for keyboard, in which you have multiple voices. You can play it on an organ, whereby you have the two sets of keyboards, as well as the pedals that you can play with your feet, as it were. In the time of the Baroque, it's before really the piano, and so they played on harpsichords, which produce an entirely different kind of sound, in which the strings are plucked instead of hit with hammers. And this is one of his fugues. It's my favorite fugue, Little Fugue in G minor, and you'll see what I mean, in which you have the multiple voices, and you can see them represented by the colors of the things that are there. So just give it a moment, and hopefully it will pick up. So here you can find the first voice. And particularly note that it'll now have this kind of thematic element that's going to be played, and then the second voice will pick it up as well. And here comes the second voice. So you can see that's what, how it is. And then the third voice will come in and the same thing. Bum, 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 bum. So you can find that kind of stuff in the Well-Tempered Clavier and the Art of the Fugue. This is a clavier, I think, not a full-grown harpsichord, but the little fugue we just heard was being played on an organ. And here is Toccata in Fugue in D minor. And I used to call this, when I was a kid, spooky music, because of the toccata at the very beginning. So here it comes in just a moment. We might speed it up in the interest of time. And there it is. And then you hear it again. Da-da-da. And that's the toccata. And then, of course, it would go into the fugue after the toccata is done. His probably most famous work is the Brandenburg Concerti, which are 6 in number. They were done for a particular fellow whose name escapes me, Marburg, I want to say perhaps, but something that comes up quite a bit. And the Brandenburg Concerti themselves could be an answer line, or they could be described in clues, in which this composer did this, that, and the other, and it would be describing the Brandenburg Concerti. But this is it. Unfortunately, the URL, not valid video any longer, but that's incredibly, incredibly famous. So you should go and at least listen to the opening of the first one. All right. Other works that you need to know for Bach as well include the besides I already mentioned, Well-Tempered Clavier, Brandenburg Concerti, the Saint Matthew, St. John's, Passions, things like that. But there's also the Goldberg variations. So that's something that comes up for him quite a bit. And just to kind of break it up here for just a second, let's go take a look at QB Reader. And I'm going to look in for Bach. There it is. And we're going to go for looking for the answer line and see what we can get with the difficulties already set. And up there we got, you see Johann Christian Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, and these are the members of his family. But here's one that obviously of the middle school level. And it was the Margrave Christian Ludwig of Brandenburg, to whom the Brandenburg Concerti are obviously composed. But here you see it ends with Goldberg variations, well-tempered clavier. Up there's another Johann Sebastian Bach. This one is a high school level. But as you can see, all of the sorts of things. Brandenburg Concerti is what it ends with. So St. Matthew Passion, which you have here. But just, for each of these, go through and try and obviously see what the sort of things that come up most often. So here, this one ends with Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Margrave, the fellow for whom he wrote the Brandenburg Concerti, and so forth and so on. But we'll continue on with our next composer, which is going to be George Frederick Handel. He's the master of the oratorio. Much like a cantata, an oratorio is going to be a work that essentially is a choral work, and the most famous of all his oratorios is Messiah. Not the Messiah, but Messiah. And of course, it has the famous Hallelujah chorus, which you can see is right there. And at a concert for Messiah, you stand up during the Hallelujah chorus. This is by far the most famous section of the entirety of it. And speed it up a little bit. And here it goes. Everybody in the audience stands up. This is from Messiah by Handel. There it is. So he also has water music, which, of course, was to be played for, I think, George II on a barge on the Thames. He also has the Royal Fireworks Suite, which celebrates a victory of some sort. I can't remember exactly which one. And also he is the composer of Zadok the Priest, which, of course, is played at every single coronation. So for Charles III recently, it was, of course, performed yet again. So there it is, Handel, George Frederick Handel. No Messiah, Zadok the Priest, water music for playing on the Royal Barge on the Thames, and of course the Royal Fireworks Suite. So we move from the Baroque into the Classical period. So the Classical period is going to begin at the beginning, roughly, of the 18th century, so 1700s. And the two composers that you need to know are going to be Mozart and Haydn. And Gluck is included as well, but he is a much lesser person for the period known as the Classical period. We call it all classical music, unfortunately, but you have the Baroque, the Classical, then later the Romantic, and so forth and so on. So here is Christoph Gluck, Orfeo ed Eurydice and Alceste are, of course, a couple of his works, Orfeo and Eurydice. Again, Orpheus, always a popular source for the subject of operas and the like. But nevertheless, then that brings us to Papa. That would be Joseph Haydn. He is essentially the father of the symphony. He wrote hundreds of them, and some of the more noted ones, as you can see here, are his London Symphony, Farewell Symphony, Surprise Symphony. The Surprise Symphony is noted because at the very beginning of it, there's a loud blast of music that enters it, and it kind of shocks you, surprises you. I like the Farewell Symphony a lot because as the Farewell Symphony is being played, one by one, musicians leave until finally the last musician to leave from the stage blows out a candle. And so there is the Farewell Symphony. And so we're going to watch just a few seconds of the last bit in which you can see how many people are on stage at the very beginning. So we go to the middle. They're still playing. And then nearer to the end, hopefully it'll catch up. Do you see? Leaving the stage one by one until the very last person. You have the two violinists still remaining. One of them is going to leave, leaving the first chair. There it is. Blowing out the candle, which is the turning out of the light. There you go. He also has an oratorio that is titled Creation. And again, remember that an oratorio is a choral work or chorus work. He also has the Military Symphony, the London Symphony, which is already mentioned and so forth and so on. Just to look him up really quickly and see how often he does come up in Quizbowl. And so we go back here, and Hayden, there is Haydn. And I must have misspelled his name. Oh well. So let's see here. If I can go to the answer line, I'm going to go for all text. Instead, we're going to put in his Farewell Symphony. Farewell Symphony. Didn't want that. There it is. And there it is. I did misspell it. Haydn. There's no D-E-N. But there you can see, obviously, Haydn is the answer line. Here's Farewell Symphony, obviously, by Haydn. And it's his 45th symphony as well. But you can see the sort of stuff that comes up for Haydn. Excuse me. But at any rate, important stuff to know. Also, the reason why I actually looked it up is that I remember that he had worked for a particular family, and that's the Esterhazy family. So that comes up quite a bit as well, the fact that he was associated with that family, the Esterhazys. But we move on to our next composer. And there we are. And that, of course, would be Mozart. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, loved by the gods. His biopic movie made about his life in 1984, Amadeus, you can see right over here, won, I think, Best Picture Oscar. But he was an absolute genius. As a young boy at the age of 5 or so, he was already composing. I think I had read something along the lines of that he had already composed his first symphony at 5 and his first opera at 7 or something of that nature. But he was just an absolute prodigy. His father, Leopold Mozart, took him on tour of Europe because he was just so astoundingly a genius at the keyboard, being able to play from memory, and so forth and so on. But some of the things that you have to note for him is that he wrote 41 symphonies, the last of which is called the Jupiter Symphony. So number 41 is known as Jupiter, not the planet, but the god. And, of course, he is noted for his operas that you can see here. The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, Così fan tutte, and The Magic Flute. When it comes to operas, what you would want to do is perhaps even make a flashcard for each one of these and note some of the characters that will come up most often. Like, for example, in The Magic Flute, it'll mention Sarastro and Pamina and the Queen of the Night and the Queen of the Night aria and so forth and so on. And also Don Giovanni is that character Don Juan, who was a womanizer but then dragged off to hell upon his death by various demons and the like. And I had the Queen of the Night aria from the Magic Flute, but unfortunately we are not able to watch it. He also has Ein klein Nachtmusik, which literally means a little night music, and when I play it, you will almost instantaneously be able to recognize it. So here we go, and... And that's Mozart, Ein klein Nachtmusik, as it were. So again, comes up quite a bit, does he? And he's worthwhile of knowing as well to look up as someone that comes up at every single level of Quizbowl. Mozart. And I'm going to put him in for only the answer line. And you will see that at the high school level, 61 results. I mean, just a whole bunch. And so it would be worthwhile, obviously, just to scroll through here. You can see his piece, Ein klein Nachtmusik, Jupiter Symphony. This is a middle school level question. Also, he had an unfinished Requiem. That would be important. And in that Requiem, you have the Lacrimosa, unfinished because he died, unfortunately, at a rather young age in his mid-30s, 35, I think it was. But at any rate, you can see all the stuff that comes up for him. There's an interesting anecdote that I'll also include, and that is that there is a sacred piece of music only played twice a year in I think, the Sistine Chapel, and it was declared illegal by the Pope to write it down. And he went and attended twice, only 2 times, a performance of it and was able to actually write it down. And so he was summoned by the Pope, but the Pope was overwhelmed. And by the way, he was, a grand age of 14 when he did it. And so it's a kind of a wild stuff all the way around. But he comes up quite a bit because he's incredibly important. And you can see here you have the Requiem that is very often that's going to come up with him. So at any rate, no Mozart. He comes up quite a bit, as you can see, 61 questions at the high school level when I put his name in. But there it is. All right, so we're almost done here. I know this is going to be a little bit more of a longer one, but we'll continue into the Romantic period. So moving from the late 1700s into the early 1800s, the 19th century, there's a movement of music that is going to become what we know of as the Romantic period. And the Romantic period is really synonymous with Beethoven. There are others, including Schubert, but Beethoven's the big guy. We all know him and his unfortunate development of deafness later in life. But Beethoven is going to vastly change the symphony. During the time of Mozart and Haydn, symphonies were like, 20, 30 minutes. His symphonies are going to be much longer. By the way, a symphony is almost always going to be in 4 movements. And so before we talk about them, though, we need to talk about his 2 most famous sonatas. You have the Pathétique Sonata on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, Moonlight Sonata, so named because it was inspired by moonlight off of Lucerne. And so you can see that the tone of Romantic music is going to be much more tempestuously moody and emotional and things of that nature. But, we move on to the next one. There's the Pathétique Sonata, and his only opera was Fidelio. It's worth knowing, again, with an opera that is important as this, to go and actually look up some of the main characters. I think there's a character named Lenore that's in it, or I could be wrong, but I'm almost positive. I want to look it up now that I am now questioning myself. And so we go with Fidelio. There it is. And 4 toss-ups on Fidelio. And Florestan is a character. So if we can have, there it is. I was right. It was Leonore was one of them. So again, it would be very helpful because by the end, if you study any music, only opera by Beethoven, it's Fidelio. But if you can recognize Florestan, Lenore, and maybe even read a quick summary of it, you'll be at quite the advantage, to be sure. But that is his only opera, Fidelio. All right, he wrote 9 symphonies, and compare that to the 100 plus written by Haydn, or the 41 written by, Mozart. And so he really changed it tremendously. And of the symphonies, the 3 that you need to know is number 3, Eroica, which is dedicated to the memory of a great man. That great man is Napoleon. Number 5, which of course opening is the famous Fate Knocking at the Door. Dun, 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 dun. And then of course the Choral Symphony, which is number 9. He had only written 9 in his lifetime. And the 4th final movement features singing Ode to Joy, particularly by Franz Schiller. But if we look at the next slide, and there it is, the 5th Symphony conducted the New York Philharmonic by Leonard Bernstein, who will come up in a later installment as being the composer of West Side Story and Candide. But he also was the longtime conductor of the New York Philharmonic. So we're about to hear Fate Knocking at the Door, Symphony number 5. Maybe I'll speed it up just a little bit. Oh, here we go. So he's ready. That's Leonard Bernstein. Just a couple more seconds. Fate Knocking at the Door. Beethoven's 5th. Among some of the most famous music of all time. And here is the Choral Symphony in which Schiller's Ode to Joy is set to music. We're going to skip to 7:15. So if we can find it here. Oh, there it is almost. Close enough. How about right there? And the 4th and final movement. And you can hear that Ode to Joy set to music. And there they go. That's why it's the Choral Symphony. All right, so now we're going to move on to Paganini. Paganini is the singular greatest violin virtuoso of the 19th century. It is unparalleled. It was claimed that he had sold his soul to the devil, and very often afterwards, there are going to be other musical pieces that are variations of Paganini and things like that, like, for example, Rachmaninoff, that we'll get to eventually. But he is the violin virtuoso. Now we move to Giacchino Rossini, the little German is his name, who is going to be noted for two particular operas. And that would be The Barber of Seville, which you can see here, and William Tell, which, of course, is the tale of a Swiss hero who shoots an apple off of his son's head. But at any rate, The Barber of Seville, the main character, is the same character as Figaro in The Marriage of Figaro. I forget which one is the prequel as far as the storyline of The Barber, and which one is the sequel, but nevertheless, it is of the same character and of the same storyline, as it were. For The Barber of Seville, you have the overture, which is the musical piece that is going to be set at the beginning of the opera, and it's famous from a treatment by Looney Tunes and Bugs Bunny. We'll take a look at it really quickly. And this is that famous overture, The Barber of Seville by Rossini. I'm going to skip ahead. So about right here. Maybe a little bit farther. So at any rate, go and watch that scene from Looney Tunes and you would recognize the overture. Also, there's an aria. An aria is literally Italian for air. Very often you find them as a solo singer within the opera. And one of the more famous ones is Largo al Factotum. It's not there, but it's essentially when Figaro is going to be singing Figaro, 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 and he says his name over and over again, which is obviously from The Barber of Seville. And then, of course, you have the William Tell Overture. Now, because you are so far moved from the 20th century, people don't recognize, but this is the finale of William Tell Overture, that opera, again, about the Swiss fellow who shoots an apple off of his son's head. And this used to be the music for the Lone Ranger, a kind of Wild West character who rode around a horse in the Wild West with a mask on, and he had his Native American sidekick named Tonto, and whenever it was time for him to save the day, they would play the William Tell Overture. And also it includes in Quizbowl, they'll talk about the calling of the cows, which are, right before the fast-paced finale, in which do 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 do, and then you have, of course, dun 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 dun, which is what we're about to hear in just a moment. And the Lone Ranger would say, "Hi-ho, Silver, away!" And then he would run off with his horse. You could just, the music evokes running, and running of horses particularly. So that's it. Rossini, the William Tell. All right, so you have Gaetano Donizetti and his opera Don Pasquale. I don't know anything more about it. I just know that necessarily it comes up in Quizbowl, and I associate binarily Donizetti, Don Pasquale. That's it. All right, so this is the last one, and just in time. Franz Schubert, composer of Lieder, that is plural in German for songs, and 9 symphonies. He did not dare write a 10th because Beethoven kind of put the kibosh on that. He wrote 9, and so people after him from superstition would not write 9. This is the Earl King, who, of course, is going to be one of his Lieder. It comes up in Quizbowl all the time. The Unfinished Symphony, which is the 8th of his. And then some of his other works include the Trop Quintet and his 9th Symphony, whereas his 8th is known as the Great Symphony. The 9th, or I should say 9th is the Great Symphony, and the 8th is the Unfinished Symphony for obviously, clear reasons. And this is the Errol King, one of his many Lieder, the singular of which is Lied. So we'll skip ahead. Es ist der Vater mit That comes up for Schubert all the time. But that's Schubert, so you got to know his leader, his unfinished symphony, his great symphony, which would be the next one. There you have number 9, and that's all that he wrote, just like Beethoven. And he also wrote the Trout Quintet. So that's it. And let's see if I can make my way back here. All right, so it was a little bit longer than normal, but that's because we had all the music playing. You could always play it up as a faster paced, but hopefully you have learned some and are now prepared to get stuff right when it comes to Quizbowl music. Good luck.